Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this session on work in the age of the intelligent machines. I think yesterday's sessions set a high bar, and we have a good panel this morning. I hope we can keep the bar aloft. The American Academy is inherently interdisciplinary, and our panel epitomizes this. We're going to be going from Irving over to Julie. Irving Władowski-Berger comes from the corporate sector, spent many years at IBM, but then he gave up one set of initials, IBM, for another set, MIT. Nelson Lichtenstein, as you heard yesterday, is an historian. Wendy Hall is a computer scientist and expert in AI, and Julie Shore is a sociologist. I am a psychologist teaching at a local school of education. I didn't expect to be wearing my ed school hat at this conference, and I was pleasantly surprised that education came up repeatedly. K-12, higher education, alternative certification were all brought up, especially yesterday afternoon. We should ask a lot of education, but probably it's not wise to ask everything of education. But there's a big change in the United States in my lifetime, and it's worth stating it explicitly. Education has switched from being a public good to being a private good. As unions have declined, so has the public stake in education, at least that education which isn't purely vocational. And there's lots to be said, as was said yesterday, about soft skills, citizenship, arts and humanities, non-vocational education, and I think we will touch on some of those important desiderata today. I'm the moderator, so my job will be to be moderate, including moderating my own views. At the end, I hope to be able to say a little bit about my own work on work, which focuses particularly on the professions. So without further ado, we're going to go from Irving to Julie, and the floor is yours, Irving.
Thank you. Let me start by asking a few questions, and these are questions that we discussed extensively yesterday. The first one is, will there be enough work in the future? Now, according to a 2014 Pew Research survey, opinions on this question are fairly evenly divided between the techno-pessimists who believe that technology advances will significantly reduce human jobs and techno-optimists like me who believe that, as has been the case in the past, technology advances will produce at least as many jobs as they displace. But as we all know, the future is unpredictable, which is why we keep looking at history for guidance about the future. Technology advances have been replacing workers and transforming industries for the past 2 centuries. These periods of change can last a very long time and have generally been quite painful for those whose jobs will never come back and who are unable to adapt to a changing economy. But over time, these same technologies have led to the creation of whole new industries and jobs. Economists keep reminding us, as they did yesterday, that previous technological innovations have always delivered more long-run employment, not less. Let me now turn to the second question. Could this time be different? While the technologies of the industrial economy help to make up for our physical limitations, our limited strength and speed, our inability to fly, the technologies of our 21st century digital economy are now enhancing our intelligence and cognitive capabilities. our increasingly smart machines are now being applied to activities that not long ago were viewed as the exclusive domain of humans. Does that mean that this time will be different? Now, AI, robotics, and deep learning might be special, but as the great British writer Arthur C. Clarke, who actually wrote the book on which 2001, the movie and so on, was based, as Arthur C. Clarke noted, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. This was the case with airplanes when they first appeared at the turn of the 20th century, and it was very much the case with the internet when it first took off in 1990s. I still remember a magical moment in 1997 when I was in a hotel room in Tokyo at 4 a.m. on a Monday, and I was able to listen to a baseball game back in New York over the internet. Now you could say, Irving, that is so trivial. Why are you even telling us that? Because in 1997, that really felt like magic. But what happens is that once we understand how the technology works, the magic wears off. The honeymoon is over, and it's now replaced by innovation and hard work. This will soon be the case with AI, in my opinion. It's a wonderful technology, but it's just another technology. The AI revolution will most likely play out like past technology revolutions and will once more give rise to new industries and exciting new jobs. But no one knows for sure. Part of the reason is that it's much easier to predict the jobs that will be automated away than to predict the new jobs that the same technologies will create. Now, yesterday, James Manica talked about a recent McKinsey report, which is really excellent, that examines in great detail the work that's likely to be displaced by automation through 2030, as well as the jobs that are likely to be created over the same period. His report, McKinsey's, overall conclusion is that a growing technology-based economy will once more create a significant number of new occupations, which will more than offset declines in occupations displaced by automation. But it warned that the transition will be very challenging, matching or even exceeding the scale of shifts out of agriculture and manufacturing from the past. McKinsey did one of the few jobs I've seen in predicting what are some of the new jobs that might be created. The most compelling one, which again James mentioned yesterday, is rising incomes around the world. At least 1 billion people around the world are rising out of poverty and have enough now disposable income to become consumers. Somebody has to develop the goods for those new kinds of consumers and sell them. And according to McKinsey, at least 300 million potential new jobs could be created around the world. Other major sources of new jobs include providing services to people like me who are getting older, and as we're living longer, we will need more and more such services, as well as investments in infrastructure, renewable energy, and climate adaptation. Let me finish by going back to another eminent Brit, John Maynard Keynes, who in 1930 predicted that the standard of living in advanced economies would be so much higher by 2030 that most people would be working a 15-hour week or so, which he believed would then satisfy their need to work in order to feel useful and contented. And would therefore those people face a really big problem, which is how to best occupy their leisure. Now, while the 15-hour week predicted by Keynes has not quite come to pass, most of us enjoy much more leisure time than was the case in generations past. Fortunately, one of the most important and underappreciated benefits of our digital age is the availability of high-quality leisure activities accessible to all at relatively low cost. Perhaps the essence, if not the details, of Keynes' 1930 prediction are coming to pass. And what will happen is that we will be balancing between work, entertainment, lifelong learning, social media, and our family life. And this, as Keynes predicted, is, I believe, the future we should all be getting ready for. Thank you.
Thank you, Irving. Nelson, you're on.
Yeah, thank you. Ford executive Delmar Harder coined the term automation in 1947. This was Detroit automation, famously deployed in 1952 when Ford's Brook Park motor assembly line used powerful drills to machine V8 engines, thereby devastating employment at the River Rouge motor building in Dearborn, where almost 10,000 workers, most African American, would lose their jobs. Thus, when UAW President Walter Reuther and Ford officials toured the Brook Park motor assembly line in 1952, the Ford execs taunted Reuther, "These machines don't pay union dues." To which Reuther replied, "They don't buy Ford cars either." This 66-year-old exchange has long colored our thinking about automation. The substitution of increasingly sophisticated machines destroys jobs, creates unemployment, and weakens social democratic institutions. Productivity increases, especially in manufacturing and mining, but Keynesian imperatives to enhance working class purchasing power does provide a resonant counter-argument, in other words, to manage automation. The fruits of such technological progress should go as much to labor as capital, so the argument would make, and that's what Keynes was making the argument that I'm glad you raised him. Ironically, in the 1950s, prognosticators saw this techno-social future through glasses that were often rose-colored, and here I would say Keynes was among them. Even among unionists and those on the left, there was much optimism. The authors of the 1964 manifesto, The Triple Revolution, which coined the term, or made it popular, cybernetics, worried about how uncultivated workers would use the additional leisure time created by automation. Leftist intellectuals rediscovered the concept of alienation, while policy entrepreneurs of the war on poverty worried about the kinds of job training programs that would best suit the unemployed in Appalachia and urban America. For many automation prognosticators of that time, there was a shared sense that technology would open up new employment possibilities, that such jobs would be highly skilled and more fulfilling than existing blue-collar work. There was, I think, in the 50s, it was a different era, one in which a certain kind of social optimism was there. And Keynes, he died earlier, but he was part of that. The main point I want to make in this presentation, however, is that the chief impact of automation is not to either destroy jobs or to create a whole new set of them, but to transform existing jobs. It's true, we today produce 3 times as many automobiles with half the workers as we did in 1947, but that's 3 generations. That's like the agricultural revolution. That's a long time. And by the way, the Brook Park engine block automation, over which the union and management argued, turned out to be a dead end. It was too rigid and capital intensive for an industry fixated on the annual model change. When it comes to the service economy, which we now live in, the numbers are even more apparent. This is because, as Darren how do you pronounce it? Acemoglu and David Autor have pointed out, the vast majority of service sector jobs involve human interaction involving the kind of tacit skills that cannot be automated and therefore will always be in demand. Not just for skilled labor, but also for the kind of labor that we label unskilled. We label it unskilled, but which is in reality involves much human sympathy, intercourse, and affectation. As Carl Polanyi once put it, we know more than we can tell. It's difficult to automate judgment and tacit skills, and that we find in the service economy. Okay, let me. And here, if you're selling a dress, if you're waiting on a table, if you're examining a patient, or if you're lecturing to a class, the actual content of your job has not changed very much in generations. The actual content of what you're doing. However, my argument is that the context in which this job takes place has in fact been automated and is subject to controls and structures which were not there previously, which has the effect. One phrase is speed up. Others are, a kind of regimentation of these tacit skills which you still possess, but the structure within which they take place is changing. Take the issue of job scheduling. That has been automated by relatively simple and primitive computer software, probably invented 40 years ago, for which any store manager or restaurant manager uses. Tens of millions of people now find themselves subject to scheduling through these forms of software, making their work week episodic, insecure, and their income volatile. We have lots of statistics on that. Something like 41% of all new entrants into the job market find that their work week is they don't really know what it is. It changes every week, every other week. This is a huge social problem. And this is the product, not just of the software, but of what I call opportunistic technology change. That is, there was a world of unorganized, relatively impotent workers in the service economy to which this new technology couldn't be applied. It would find little resistance. The technology therefore functions in an opportunistic fashion. You couldn't apply this on the docks or in a unionized factory, but you could apply it in your Walmart store and your restaurant. What this means is that we have leisure time, yes, but it's not the leisure time that Keynes or Daniel Bell or others were talking about. It's a kind of enforced leisure, a kind of insecure leisure, a kind of extra time which is not producing income or security. And therefore, and here I agree with Louis Hyman. He made the point yesterday, and it's in my paper, that Uber and the TaskRabbit and the whole gig economy is parasitic to the insecurity and precarity of 30, 40, 50 million people now in the service economy. And they take advantage, and in fact, from the point of view of someone in one of these insecure jobs, the Uber provides a way of smoothing out income, getting a little extra, but they would not exist without this enforced leisure time, which is available to them, to those web-based platforms to use. So I think that I'm interested in a way in old technologies more than new technologies. Old technologies have more impact because the deployers of these older technologies can see where they can be deployed, and then they will, in this opportunistic fashion, go at them. Those of you who are inventing the latest new technology, they're all great, fantastic, but whether or not they'll be deployed or not, whether or not they'll be transformative, depends not so much on the quality of that technology itself, but on the social and political context in which you attempt to deploy it. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Nelson. We're halfway through the formal presentations, And I realize that before we open it up to questions, I want to give the panelists a chance to comment on one another's presentations if they want to, because we haven't actually heard ourselves speak until just now. So, Wendy?
Thank you very much. Yes, I'm a computer scientist. I'm not known as an AI researcher, really, although, in fact, when I was asked to do the UK government AI review, which came out of the blue, the call from number 10, you answer them usually. I thought back to my career, and actually I did start, I'm a pure mathematician, and using some of that in my research today, but I did start out in my world in computer science in intelligent tutoring systems, and my first project used Prolog, which is a logic programming language, and at that time, there was an expert system called MySyn, which was, this was what, the 70s, which was all about how you talk to a doctor, an AI doctor, we would call it today, and got a diagnosis. But of course, in those days, the computers weren't fast enough, and there was not the data to use to enable the machines to do the analysis, and that's what's different today. There is an awful lot of what a lovely acronym, GOFAI, G-O-F-A-I, good old-fashioned AI. Good old-fashioned AI is everywhere, right? Talking to Andrew State. In the planes, a lot of us have flown in to get here. They are operated by good old-fashioned AI. Very, very, very heavily evaluated and tested, and, you know, but there's a lot of expert systems around, decision-making systems, knowledge-based systems. The finance industry runs on good old-fashioned AI. What's different today is that machine learning, which is really based on the phenomenon that came out in the 80s of neural networks, has become deep learning because we're able to, because of the fast processing power, because we can do parallel processing, and because we've got huge amounts of data to train the systems on. And deep learning is just layers and layers and layers of neural networks. And it's getting closer and closer to how the brain operates. And I'm not saying that what we see today with the AlphaMind algorithm, AlphaGo algorithm beating the Go champion is yet human intelligence at all. But you can see the way it could build up to be over time. I'll make the point now, and I make it again at the end, that it's very interesting, the whole, starting with Turing and, you know, can machines think? We're now in an era where we're looking at, there's a whole philosophy about could you have a machine that is the same as a human being, and the whole Turing test about can you compare a machine and a human and decide. That's sort of got a bit passé, and really today we're looking at machine intelligence versus human intelligence, right? Now, whether we can actually ever get a machine that has all the stuff that make us up in terms of intelligence, but also conscience and soul and, you know, the sort of deep philosophical stuff that makes us what we are, is one question. Can we get machines that can make decisions better than we can? Yes, we can. And that's the worry about, that's why this technology is different. Because if it works, and you might be right, it might, and I suspect, as I said yesterday, this bit of the revolution will deliver so much, and then there'll be a bit of a winter again, and then there'll be another rise of the AIs. But it's like the Daleks in Doctor Who, if any of you watch Doctor Who. What always defeats the Daleks is they can't climb stairs, right? But we can build machines that can climb stairs if we allow them, you know. And so there is that we have to, I think, be very careful. I'll come back to that. So why am I here? I think I'm here. Well, apart from the fact I do a lot for the Society, the Royal Society, I co-chaired the UK Government AI Review, which Anthony Phillipson talked about last night. That has become part of the industrial strategy, and we will be launching, I hope, next month, although we can never get the number 10 slot, as they call it. We will be launching the AI sector deal in the UK, which will pick up the recommendations from our review, which are all online. Just type in Wendy Hall UK Government AI, and you'll find it, because Google will lead you there. And you can see all the recommendations. Anthony talked about them last night very much. One of them was the Centre for Data Ethics, which is actually called Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation, because you can't do anything in the UK without adding the word innovation these days. And Claire Craig and the team at the Society led the data governance report that very much led to that with our review. That they are actually advertising for the chair at the moment, and with the sector deal, and I think this is quite brave of the UK government. It's saying, we're going to fund AI, not enough, but some, to make it a sector like we have an automotive sector, an aeronautical sector, and a pharmaceutical sector. We are going to fund an AI sector, and we're going to consider the ethics and the regulation and the standards around that. So that's what I've been doing, and it's been a great ride. And there's as we roll the recommendations out, more fun to come. I would disagree with Irvin, because my background is studying the internet. The internet is not just another technology, I would argue, because it's co-constituted between society and technology, not like other technologies. And I think the big thing about AI is it's got to be thought of in a socio-technical way. My worry about the future is that the things we buy and the services we use, the algorithms will have been written in China. And I love the Chinese, I love going to China, but their culture is completely different. And therefore the bias in the algorithms will be different. And my term for bias in AI is bias in and bias out, basically. If we don't take care of the data and the cultural bias or the gender bias or the age bias, then the things we buy will not be fit for purpose. That may mean we don't use them, but, you know, look at what the internet has given us. This comes back to the point about leisure. Because of the network effect, largely, and we are all, the younger generation, I'm not younger generation, but I am addicted to this. And I find it very hard if I can't have that near me. And I'm always on WhatsApp, and I tweet. And the millennials are more into this, much more into this than we are. And we know now. You think back to what happened with the smoking, the tobacco industry and lung cancer. Took decades to prove the link between smoking and lung cancer. With data science today, we could do that in a snap. If you've got the data after a few years of people dying. With social media, we know that the social media companies have deliberately used AI and gaming techniques to get people addicted, right? And we can probably prove that using data science these days. The effects are very insidious. Now, have we got more leisure? I feel I've got less leisure. What came out of the IT industry was a leisure industry. Fabulous new jobs, not predicted. I pay my personal trainer. I go to the gym, pay him to make me work hard for an hour. And then when I go to the gym on my own, I think, where's Adam? Who's telling me what to do? So I don't go, right? And anyway, that's another story. Shopping. I'm going shopping tonight because I have to squeeze it in between 4:30 and dinner. Is that fair? Right? I want an AI to bring me the stuff from the Eileen Fisher shop. We were talking about this yesterday and have it delivered here. Thank you. But not today, it won't. I've got to get a taxi downtown and I'll have to call Uber or something. Anyway, so I've run out of time and I've got so much more I could say. There's a lot of problem about overclaiming for AI. There was a thing recently, I can't remember, I think it came from Italy, about giving a robot human rights. It wasn't even an AI robot, actually, completely misleading to the media, by the media, for the public. But then you get into, should AIs pay tax? And should they become members of a union? I've said bias in, bias out. One more thing I want to say and then I'll finish. I do think there's a time now where we can get radical. There will be job losses, and we had a great session yesterday on the trucking industry in America. And it's no doubt, lorry driving, trucking industry, whatever you call it, those types of jobs are going to disappear. But what isn't going to disappear is the need for people to help the elderly. As they get, I want someone who's going to come in and mow my lawn, and we've got to really value the caring jobs and the jobs that stop people being isolated in this heavily commute. I mean, you can be so lonely in an internet world, can't you? I think, when I think of my 96-year-old mother, where's Barbara Gross, and she, and so I think that we can be radical. We can think about living wages, and we can think about. And not every truck driver needs to become a computer programmer, Megan. Great, some of them can, but some of them could just go and mow the lawn, and be valued for that. That's what we need. I think there's a real chance we could get society rethinking its values in this world. And I will finish by making the point I made yesterday.
Last point.
Yes, is that I really believe this stuff could make a difference in the future. And what we do now will determine whether we eventually become slaves to the machine or not, right? Because if we don't get it right and we don't think about the issue that machines are becoming more intelligent, and we don't think about the ethics and the standards and the regulation and the impact on society, then we will end up in a world where machines use us as slaves.
Okay. Thank you, Wendy. I was actually taking notes while you were talking, and then I realized that I wasn't sure when you were talking about China, and you used the word bias, whether this was B-I-A-S or B-U-Y-U-S.
Could be either, actually. I was meaning B-I-A-S in a cultural sense. I do not believe all Chinese people are evil. There's lots of things the Chinese government does that's better than the way we operate in the US, but there's, or UK or Europe. I was talking about bias, cultural bias, B-I-A-S.
Okay, thank you.
But it could also be that they have different buying habits.
Right, and we've noticed you're quite interested in buying, but that's that's for 4:30, right?
I put in Who's Who, it lists my hobby as shopping.
Okay. All right, thank you.
I could have...
You need to read my earlier book, but we'll talk about that afterwards.
About shopping?
The Overspent American.
Oh.
Okay,
All right.
So... I wanted to start, I'm Juliet Shore, economist and sociologist. I wanted to start with the question of whether this time is different. It's really hard to get off this. We ended yesterday with the consensus that it is not, and of course Irving also raised that point. There are two factors that are very different now, and they're really important in understanding what has happened in the past. Number one is GDP growth, and the other is trends in working hours. So if we think about previous eras of automation, mechanization, they were mostly periods of high GDP growth. In fact, those two things tend to go together. 1913 to 1915 in the US, 3% annual growth. In the so-called Golden Age, 1950 to 1973, in Europe, you had 5% growth rates. In the US, almost 4% growth rates. We are now in the era of 2% growth rates for Europe and North America, or at least US and Canada, I think. And I think they're unlikely to go much higher in the next couple of decades. That's a much longer conversation. I don't think we really understand why, but we're on this long-term trend of lower growth rates. It's the so-called Golden Age was an anomaly. Second, working hours. Between 1870 and 1950, which is the period at which average annual working hours stopped falling in the United States. And I'm going to use my rebuttal time to talk about the trends in working hours. But working hours, working hours went from 3,000 hours a year to, now they're all the way down to about 1,500 in the lowest countries of northwestern Europe. U.S. a little bit higher. Hours actually started rising in the U.S. after 1970, but there's no appetite in either region at the moment for reducing working hours. But high GDP growth and falling working hours were absolutely central to absorbing displaced labor, from the late 19th century until the present in Europe, in fact, and until hours, started to change in the United States. So I think we really need to remember that these macro trends are key to what happens overall to employment. And there's one other point, which is that in the Industrial Revolution, we had the opposite effect, which was big increases in working hours because of that productivity, increased productivity of labor. And so there's then the pressure for people to work longer hours as they become much more productive. So the trends in working hours and the trends in GDP are going to be important in answering this question. And it's something that almost never gets talked about in the conversation. Okay. I'm going to come back to GDP growth in a minute. But I did want to make a second point about the gig economy because it came up a lot yesterday. Nelson brought it up again today. I've been studying the gig economy since 2012. Now, what I've been doing is in-depth interviews with workers. So we don't have good overall data to do, good quantitative studies unless we get it from the companies, and they don't give it to independent researchers. But from the qualitative findings, I think a key insight for this conversation is that we find that workers' experience in the platform or gig economy strongly depends on their degree of dependence on their gig earnings to pay their basic expenses. And a really important thing about this sector is there's tremendous diversity in this labor force. You have a significant number of people who have full-time jobs who are also gig laborers. And then you have a much smaller group who are what we call dependent workers. And that's about just under 30% from our sample. In contrast to the dominant, now, so what is the dominant discourse saying about sort of the key factors that drive outcomes on the gig labor platforms? Number one is policy and employment classification. So a lot of attention's been paid to, are these employees or 1099 workers? And secondly, to technology, more our issue here, algorithmic control of the workers. So what we find is that workers who are what we call supplemental earners avoid algorithmic control to a much larger extent than dependent workers. It's obvious. They can afford to say, I'm not going to follow the rules, I'm going to do it my way, I don't care if I'm deactivated, et cetera, because they're, to use an older, not exactly parallel but similar concept from economics, the cost of job loss for these workers is much, much less than those who are fully dependent. And the outcomes for the fully dependent workers are very poor in comparison to the supplementals, whether we're talking about satisfaction, safety, precarity, all these things. But what's key about this finding is that success on these platforms to date is reliant on free riding on employment. And if technological unemployment and all of the other factors that are reducing full-time employment continue as it has been, then this gig labor model it's not clear that it's going to work, or if it works in the sense of being able to get workers because they're desperate, which is what some of our people are for sure, then it's going to be yielding really bad outcomes, which gets us back to where Margaret started yesterday, which is the moral economy and what kind of outcomes do we want. So the last point I wanted to make is one actually that Moshe Vardi raised in his opening comments. Very, very important, but the conversation about it has been segregated from the conversation about the future of work, and that is climate change. And I don't think we can separate these two for two reasons. Number one, now I'm back to GDP. If we take the mitigation targets that the rich countries must achieve to avoid catastrophic climate change, we are talking about 10% annual emissions reductions, far beyond what we have achieved to date, except, the only time we get anywhere close to that is during recessions. We do not yet have a path forward that allows us to increase GDP and achieve emissions reductions of the type we are morally obligated to, and practically obligated to as well. We're just, our increases in GDP just erase too much of the emission reduction, and that, so-called coupling between GDP and emissions is still too tight. It is starting to loosen, but we're not there yet. So that's number one. That means more problem on the employment front if we're still in this slow growth world for climate reasons. But I think there's another dimension that's really important, which is, let me just call it rising climate mayhem, which is that if we think about moral economy, dignified work, social contract, workers' rights, all the things that came up yesterday that we say are really important for us to have a positive future with AI and technological change, It's very hard to think about how we're going to achieve those in the context of rising sea levels, extreme weather, climate migration, which will be large, drought, water scarcity, huge economic losses, which we're already starting to see. So I think that the conversation has to include both. We talked yesterday about resilience. Of course, the climate conversation, resilience is at the core of the climate conversation. But we need to cope with climatic changes at the same time that we're going to be coping with big changes from AI and technological innovation. And, you know, the dystopian view, of course, is the ugly scenario of authoritarianism, violence, what some people call Fortress America. We can already see that one rising, and Fortress Europe as well. The alternative is a kind of radical solidarity that addresses both climate and technology with the same sort of vision. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. Actually, I was taking notes on you, Julie, also. And then when you said climactic change, I wasn't sure whether it was climax or climate or both. Well, I think you can see in the panel both a fault line in terms of optimism, pessimism, realism, and a question about if there are big issues to face, where does the agency come from, whom, and how powerful is it, and how controllable is it? As I said, I wanted to give the panel a chance to react to what they heard from the other panelists, so this is your chance to give me a wave. Nelson?
Yeah, I just wanted to support something that Julie said about productivity, about growth in incomes and such in the 1870, 1950. You know, Robert Gordon wrote the book, American Growth, I think, right? Mm-hmm. And I mean, this is also sustaining my perspective as well. that you know, so he says from 1870 to 1970, we had these high levels of growth and therefore income, et cetera. And his point was that this was based on, well, yes, there was technological change, but it was kind of, you know, kind of not simplistic, but it was technological change like clean water and, you know, sewers and then electrification, things which are they become pervasive. They take a while to become pervasive, but they have tremendous impact. And that's what I think that, in other words, I'm sort of urging that kind of a look at that. Things that are not quite so at cutting edge, but which nevertheless have this enormous impact. And that's why I was mentioning the point about software which enables store managers and restaurant managers to alter schedules. These are not high tech, but these in a negative way have this tremendous impact on the way tens of millions of people live.
Hurry?
Yeah, let me discuss briefly this question of the lack of productivity growth despite our incredibly advancing technologies. And, you know, one of the nice things about no longer working full time and being able to hang out at MIT is that I get to spend time with really good economists like Eric Brynjolfsson. And he recently wrote a paper about this paradox of how come productivity growth has been relatively low compared to advances in technology. And they examine a number of possible reasons. And the one they chose is a version of the Solow paradox, which means that, you know, Solow asked that question in the 1980s, I believe. And the more advanced the technology, and God knows AI and all the other stuff around it is very advanced, the longer it will take for the impact of the technology to be reflected in productivity growth, because very advanced technologies require all kinds of restructures of business models, of other technologies around them to bring out what they are good at. And so we may all think we are past AI. We are in the first inning of AI, I know some of you are from Britain, and you may not know what I'm talking about. We are in the very early stages of AI, and it's quite possible that as these technologies advance, we will reach the point where they will translate into productivity growth. The other point, Julie, is people like me are getting older, and in advanced economies and in a number of other economies like China, there will be fewer workers. In fact, I believe Africa is the only place where there is still a lot of young people. Almost everywhere else, it's been going down. And so there could be a scarcity of workers in, I don't know, a few decades. And that's another reason to feel that there will be jobs because there will be fewer workers to fill them. So that's part of my optimism.
It does seem that if the caring profession grows a great deal, it doesn't make a lot of demands on climate, or it needn't. I mean, it's very soft in terms of those demands. Julie?
Yeah. Oh, well, so just a point on the demographic changes, which is, I mean, that's certainly true for Europe and Japan. In the U.S., we still have, due to immigration. And it's not only, Africa's the place where you have high fertility. You have very large numbers of young people in Asia, Latin America, et cetera. And this was my point about climate migration, because the wealthy countries are primarily responsible for the buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And to say, no, we're not going to take immigrants from places which have become uninhabitable, I think is barbaric. And so if we are sort of morally responsible, the labor forces in the wealthy countries actually should be growing as a result of immigration going forward. Whether we will or not, I don't know, but that's part of the scenario. And on the productivity, I think you may have misunderstood me. My point was just that when you have rapid productivity growth, you often get increases in working hours because that's what's profitable.
I understand.
Yeah.
I understand.
Wendy?
Just a couple of things. I think the issue of climate change, we clearly need to address it, but it's so complicated. And as you say, we all live our lives and we like to be in this type of, we don't want to be, are we prepared to reduce our living standards to help other parts of the world? I'm not talking about immigration here, I'm just talking about when you go to China and India, and they clearly want to have this sort of living standards. They want the air conditioning, they want the transport, they want the connectivity. And I sit in Singapore in a restaurant with a fur on because it's so cold, because the air conditioning is turned up so high. And I think this is a world gone mad. And it's all about sustainability of the planet, actually. So maybe we should develop AI to make sure we can go and inhabit other planets and get off this one and leave it to what it... But I say that facetiously. But the other thing I wanted to mention was this, we've got more time. I feel there's a huge dichotomy. Yes, all the figures show we have more time, but actually, I bet the people in this room don't feel like they've got more time than their parents or grandparents had. I certainly don't. And... there's huge pressures to deliver all the time because of the connectivity. But also the other consequence of the way we're living our lives is obesity. And that's a problem for the Western world's problem that is rapidly becoming the Eastern world's problem. 20% of people in China are diabetic. 20%. That is a huge number. And they're going through what we've gone through in the last few decades, in 20 years, 30 years, a huge increase in terms. So more leisure time seems to give rise to more obesity, and all the problems that brings. And I'm going to read your book.
Yeah, but you need to read Overworked American first,
Okay.
because actually the people in this room do not have more leisure time.
I haven't got time.
No, they don't have time without income is not leisure. I mean, it's anxiety and I mean, and that's what huge numbers of people.
Okay, we're going to open it up, but I think maybe it's who gets to control the time.
Well, right, yeah.
And that's my job, right?
Yes.